Do you dare disturb the universe? Sunday, March 3rd, 2024. The reading is from John 2. It is familiar yet challenging text of Jesus overturning the tables on the money changers in the courtyard of the Holy of Holies, the Jerusalem temple, and the center of worship for the people of the Jewish faith. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume him." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. In the unity movement, there are 12 powers, but they each have to have a counterpart. For instance, today we see Jesus burning with zeal, doing a very violent act, but it almost always needs to be coupled with the counterpart, wisdom. This story is familiar to me, but when I began reflecting on it for today's homily, I delved more deeply into it. Have you ever read a book to the very end only to be left with a cliffhanger needing to buy the next book in the series to resolve the crisis in the one that was just cut out suddenly, without warning? This is like a 5-act play, with only the first act played out before us today, leaving us wondering and questioning, trying to figure out if all of it applies to us too, or any part of it. The event of Jesus' overturning the tables in John also appears in all the synoptic gospels. In fact, Jesus cleansed the temple on 2 separate occasions, once at the beginning of his ministry and again at the end. In contemporary Christian circles, the phrase, "Jesus overturns tables" or "Jesus flips tables" is used to communicate the iconoclastic nature of Jesus' ministry. The saying also serves to counterbalance the distorted modern portrayal of the Son of God as an insipid, weak man who was all about peace and love and never about correction or judgment. We see that Jesus overturns tables in many ways in the scripture. He countered the incomplete teaching of the scribes. He confronted the hypocrisy of the Pharisee. He reached out to the tax collectors and sinners. He violated custom, and he publicly spoke against the king. Excuse me, there's a dog cutting in on us. All right. We should recognize that Jesus' actions were justified. His anger was properly motivated, rightly focused, and self-controlled. So why did Jesus overturn tables? Conducting commerce within the temple was problematic by itself, as that undermined the sacred purpose of the place. Yet there were deeper issues at play. It seemed that it wasn't just business taking place, but exploitation. The devout were being cheated. Especially vulnerable were foreigners and the poor, in direct violation of God's commands. Yes, the money changers were in the courtyard of the temple. They were still necessary. People came, some of them traveling for weeks, to behold the wonder of the temple, resurrected after its destruction by the Babylonians 6 centuries before. They must have been tired, thirsty, wanting to exchange their own currency so that they could at last at least once in their lives, enter the Holy of Holies, sort of like the Islamic command 7 centuries later for all Muslims to make a pilgrimage, a Hajj, to Mecca. After that visit, even if only once, they could call themselves Haji, those who had fulfilled this holy obligation. There are many pilgrims that were standing around the money changer's table with much traveled and probably hoarded money, and no way to enter the temple to worship on that day. I bet they would be pissed. Did they even have enough supplies to stay over another day? Or will they just have to turn around and return home to meet their obligations there? What would their stories be? What implications does this event on John chapter 2 hold for us today? First, the same Jesus who played with children and conversed gently with a Samaritan woman could also construct a whip and overturn tables. He embodies the traits of both a lion and a lamb. In fact, Jesus had to, if he had failed to express anger against the sin of oppression. What kind of person shrugs at abuse? Second, given that Jesus sets the standard for goodness, there are appropriate times to not be nice. There are times we cannot simply go on and just get along. We should emulate Jesus' example and confront abuse and injustice. When God's reputation is at stake and when people are being exploited, we need to act. Let us take a look to the past to see how those who spoke out and acted just as fiercely as Jesus did. In World War II, and let's start there, here's a picture of the American news correspondent Eric Sevareid, who was posted in Germany as the Third Reich took hold and revealed its racist and incendiary policies. Historian David McCullough narrates the story of how the young CBS reporter Eric Sevareid changed his pacifist ideals after reporting on the rise of fascism in Europe during World War II. This book documents this shift from the isolationist position he took as a leader in the college peace movement of the 1930s to his advocacy of the U.S. intervention against fascism in Europe, where he was stationed as a radio correspondent. Sevareid survived the war and returned to his job in the U.S. and did not die until the ripe old age of 92. The next picture is of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had a similar story with a different ending. Born in Germany, Bonhoeffer got a theology degree from Union Seminary in New York, but returned to Germany, this land of his birth, as Hitler and his cohorts were rising to power. He was a total pacifist, going to start an underground seminary where the students were taught to stand up to injustice, unlike the compliant Lutheran pastors in Germany, who were paid by the state and who chose to stay silent as fascism and its attendant violence and rhetoric escalated. As the violence grew, Bonhoeffer, after much careful thought and prayer, decided to join his brother-in-law. When the plot was discovered, he was sent to prison in 1943 and executed by hanging 2 years later. Von Stauffenberg died by a firing squad 4 days later, just after he was arrested. During Bonhoeffer's time in prison, he wrote The Cost of Discipleship and Prison Letters, still bedrock books for any serious student of theology. What you see in front of you is the scaffold by which he lost his life and his head. Unlike Sevareid, who probably died peacefully several days later, Bonhoeffer's end came on April 9, 1945, only a month before the end of the war in Germany and the 3 weeks before Hitler commits suicide on April 30th of 1945. This picture is of the gallows of Flossenburg prisoner, where Bonhoeffer was hanged. Before the executioners took Bonhoeffer from his cell, they ordered him to strip So his last steps to his end of his earthly life were as he was as naked as the day he was born. To the very end, he is faithful to the preaching of the confessing church that preached against cheap grace, serving as a cover for ethical laxity. Costly grace, on the other hand, is the gospel which must be fought again and again. It is costly because it costs a man his very life, and is grace because it gives a man the only true life. There were many other ways to protest the rise of Hitler. Jehovah's Witnesses served as housekeepers in the camps for officers and their families, because the witnesses eschewed violence of any kind. Others became spies, others housed Jewish families. One of my most edifying stories is that of Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were a brother and sister who were members of the White Rose, a student group in Munich that was active in the nonviolent resistance movement in Nazi Germany, especially by distributing flyers against the war and the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler. By February 22nd, 1943, they had been sentenced to death by the People's Court, led by the Judge-President Roland Freischler, and were executed by guillotine on the same day in the Style Line prison. Their lives ended more quickly, with only 4 days in prison, as rapidly as the guillotine cut off their heads. Take a moment to look at the same scaffold that ended their lives. If they had kept silent, they probably would have survived the war for years and had full lives to look forward to. But on this day, their heads would literally roll towards the feet of their executioner, their final offering after a swift and hopefully painless death. In post-war Germany, Hans and Sophie Scholl are now recognized as symbols of German resistance against the totalitarian Nazi regime. The Vietnam War protests hit close to home for me, and the protests were for the most part nonviolent. While I was still in utero, about to be born, until after World War II ended, I was a young adult and college student when the protests at the University of California, Santa Barbara heated up. This time I was cognizant of the issues involved. I was one of the students who, from a lectern and microphone and podium, read the growing list of the young men who had been killed in war. We wore black armbands to classes. We held sit-ins and signs. As the anger grew and as more and more young male students were being drafted, on February 27, 1970, their pent-up anger was turned on the Bank of America, which was burned to the ground. Was this just a random act, or was there a deeper meaning to it? The Bank of America had been giving illegal loans to the South African countries and indirectly supporting apartheid against government regulations, amongst other unsavory endeavors. It had illegally funneled money to the Pretoria regime, which consisted of mostly white men in South Africa, enforcing discriminatory apartheid rules towards the black population. By funding their economic and military endeavors, the Bank of America was supporting the perpetuation of a deadly racist society to gain access to mineral resources in South Africa. Corporations like these have monetized human suffering for years, and the students in Isla Vista no longer tolerated the blind acceptance of human rights violations. Very soon, a bucket brigade was formed to try to save the bank building. A member of my church, a senior in economics, and his roommate tried to join the fire line with a bucket brigade. He paid with his life, as he was shot to death by one of the surrounding law enforcement agencies. This placard was placed on the campus to continue to honor his memory. While I was not there, even to witness the bank burning beyond the barricades, it did hit me personally. I was on the desk at the entrance to St. Mark's Catholic Church when his parents came in to speak with the priest. The police officer was acquitted by claiming that his rifle misfired. Let's flash to a snapshot of the present to round this out, where people have had to make choices about how they were to respond to repression and discrimination. As I was preparing this homily, I thought of three personal friends who exemplify costly grace. The first is Father Antonio Nyandoro Ocharo from Nisi, Kenya. When I first met him on Facebook, my first question to him was, do you support LGBT people fully? He said that he was an outspoken ally. When there had been a funeral earlier for his daughter, most of his fellow clergy did not go because they objected to his full welcoming of those outcasts and outsiders. He was living and continues to live costly grace. The next picture is one of my daughter, the daughter of my heart, Fauna, also from Kenya, whom I have grown to love deeply as our lives and visions have become more and more intertwined. Here she is at one of the many public events she goes to protest in full rue of a condemning law and unforgiving version of so-called Christianity. She has opened her home to LGBT dissidents fleeing their home country to a neighbor land, and her sister and their 3 children fleeing domestic violence. Every day she lives a life of costly grace, never knowing that this might quite literally put her on the firing line or legal repercussions of Christian condemnation. Then the last one. This is my favorite picture of my friend, Reverend Kristen Wolfe Peters, a fellow disciple of Christ, a clergywoman, protesting against discrimination against black people by sitting down and holding a sign in front of the flange of riot gear-clad police forces. She was arrested and imprisoned until her bail was posted, and months later, the charges against her were finally dropped. The question of, do you dare to disturb the universe, is by no means cut and dried. We can have peaceful protests, we can write letters to legislators, and in the case of Severide and Bonhoeffer, can even legitimately conclude that only opposing force needs to be used. The question, do I disturb the universe, should really be this question. In the face of injustice, discrimination, even unkindness, how can you not disturb the universe? Go out and upset some tables, speak out loud and clear. This is no time to be silent.